Today we're going to talk about different schools of Buddhist philosophy, and in a sense there's a problem. Yes? Did you have a question? Right there? I'm sorry. Back first. About 2,500 years ago, there was this Shramana movement that we talked about. And so the very idea of, like, let's get out of here, get out of the city, or get out of the town, to go back to nature, meditate, not be restricted by the caste system, not be bound to perform all these highly formal and technical rituals, and just let's try to figure out what life is really all about. That was a very hot thing back then. But when all the dust cleared, it turned out to be very simple. And as the Vedic tradition started to respond and to this challenge of Buddhism and Jainism, there was a problem in Buddhism which I want to go over. First of all, basically what Buddha taught, sort of like the bottom line, bare bones, sort of everybody agrees on, were four noble truths, which are very simple. We suffer because we're selfish. Number two. Number three, selflessness, in other words, not being selfish, and suffering, and the Dharma life, living according to Dharma, right thinking, right speech, right behavior, and so on, leads to a selfless life and then suffering. And then you have this grammatically negative term, nirvana, without vana, which is the payoff. If you follow the Dharma path, you become free of all the suffering. And then also, in the second sermon which the Buddha gave, he said that there are 5 things that we are not. Just like nirvana, no vana, is grammatically a negative term. So also the second sermon, which has become sort of immortalized in Buddhism as a sermon on the non-existence of the self, where Buddha says everything except that the self doesn't exist. Anyway, Buddha says that there are 5 things which are not the eternal soul. It's not the rupa, the visible body, the vedana, sensations or feelings, sangya. Sangya in Sanskrit it means like a definition or naming, so we have a tendency to categorize everything. Like if you're walking in the forest, you see a tree, like, what do you call that? Somehow when you know the name of the tree, then somehow you've actually experienced it if you know the name of it. Or what's the name of this town? And so we have this tendency to categorize everything. And so sangya and then samskara, psychological conditioning. Like, for example, let's say you're born in this life and you're afraid of heights. Maybe in your last life you fell off a high place. So what's considered an irrational phobia, you're afraid of heights, could just be your deep psychology based on your previous life experiences. So we bring into this life, according to this view, all this deep psychology based on our past life conditioning. And that's called samskara. In fact, the yoga system, as we'll learn when we talk about yoga, is meant to help one to transcend all this deep conditioning from past lives. And then, I didn't put the Sanskrit word. Don't sue me. That's vijnana, or worldview. Sort of like how you put it all together, your ultimate impression of the world. So, and that's kind of it. And as I'll read, I'm going to get into, yes?
On the third one,
yes.
What does that say?
Oh, this one.
Yeah.
Sangya, yes?
I don't know where.
Oh,
Yeah.
naming.
Oh, okay.
There you go. Naming. So I'm trying to figure out a simple way to express that Sanskrit word. So the tendency to name things and to sort of feel that you're understanding things because you're naming them. Now, Buddha, well, to read, sort of had no view. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that he actually was trying to get people away from having philosophies. Like, that's why you have to, like, immediately experience the reality of, I guess, Buddha consciousness or something. And the way you do this is by not getting involved in a lot of words and philosophies and metaphysics. Like, don't do metaphysics. Just kind of meditate and get into this consciousness. So therefore, there's a lot of evidence that the original Buddha had no view. And people didn't write back then. When Buddha appeared, there's very little evidence there was writing. So by the time I wrote things down, and they're writing things down from someone who's just... Now, if you look at this stuff here, you could argue this is just practical psychology. This is something you can experience. This is not a question of someone's sophisticated metaphysics like my view on God or the soul. This is just something that any ordinary person can experience if they think about it. And even this stuff over here, that if you meditate or if you really think that I'm not the body, because that's the example Krishna will give in the Bhagavad Gita, that we're changing from infancy to childhood to youth to middle age, old age, whatever, and yet there's the same person. Well, that's obviously not what Buddha said. But still, by thinking about it, you can experience that this is not really me. I am aware of my body. I'm aware of my feelings. In fact, that's one of the typical self-help techniques they use nowadays. Like, take a step back and look at your feelings. And so you can get a distance from your body, your feelings, all kinds of things. But who is the person that's observing the body and the feelings and the analyzing capacity we have? Who is actually observing all these things? So Buddha felt that any person, just by thinking really hard, meditating, could realize, I'm not these things. So this you could all put in the category of practical psychology, experiential psychology. As far as a metaphysical view, what is the ultimate nature of the universe and souls and God and stuff like that, Buddha apparently told people, don't get hung up with that. It may sort of interfere with your meditation. But when Buddhism is competing centuries later in an intellectually very sophisticated environment with all kinds of metaphysics and philosophies, and they're competing for the hearts and minds of the people, and so they start to come up with their own views on these things, which are difficult to trace back to the historical Buddha. So they come up with the idea of, there's a key term found in the Lotus Sutra, Kaushalya means expertise, being really clever, and upaya means a practical means. So the ideas that Buddha employed, he taught this very simple stuff, this basic practical psychology to his early followers because they were not the best and the brightest, and that's all they could figure out. So that when later Buddhism started to develop all kinds of metaphysics and views of the universe and heavens and paradise and all kinds of philosophy, they said, well, that's what Buddha really meant, but he couldn't teach his early disciples because, well, they were not so bright. Interestingly, in chapter 14 of the book of John in the New Testament, you have a Greek-speaking Jesus, after the fact saying that I had more to tell you, but you can't hear it now, so later the Holy Spirit will speak through the church. In other words, you have the church basically claiming that whatever doctrines they are creating, and they were quite productive in that, it's actually Jesus speaking through them. So you have, anyway, so this idea that the original historical figure said this, but later an institution says that, but that's what the original figure actually meant, he just didn't say it, is something you find in many religions, actually. So, I want to get into this a little more in detail, this basic idea, and see what different kinds of philosophies they came up with. So, here's a quote from a book by Richard King, who teaches at Vanderbilt, so even though sometimes Florida competes with them in sports, still consider what he said. There is certainly plenty of evidence in the earliest strata of Buddhist teachings that the Buddha is represented as one who does not hold a view. He does not hold a view. The Buddha, here's something, one of our textbooks, the Indian philosophy book. The Buddha was a harsh critic of the views and claims of others in many respects. He rejected outright all of the various ontological stances, that means metaphysics, like God, the soul, the nature of reality, existence, all that. Harsh critic, rejected outright all the ontological views of others. He considered their dependence on tradition rather than their own experiential understanding to be deeply unreliable, self-invalidating. But of course, later Buddhism had its own traditions that people depended on. So here you have a Buddha, again, emphasizing psychological experience, direct experience, meditation techniques, not ontology. Here's another quote from our book. The Buddha was denying not people's selves, but that anything exists independently. And here's something the book says, which I thought was, what? This clearly is in contrast to the claims of others of the permanence of selfhood. Well, let me go over that again, because I think it makes no sense philosophically. The Buddha was not denying people's selves, but that anything exists independently. This clearly is in contrast to the claims of others of a permanence of self. In other words, some people in India are saying there's a permanent self, there's an eternal self, Atman. And later in the course we'll talk a lot about that because most people in India came to believe there was such a thing as a soul or a self. And so Buddha's emphasizing that anything temporary is not the eternal self, like we saw in that second sermon. So to say that this is in contrast to people who think there is an eternal self, but the people who think there is an eternal self, like the followers of the Upanishads and Vedanta and so on, as we'll see, explicitly rejected, as Buddha did, all the temporary aspects of our psychophysical situation as not being eternal self. In other words, the people on the Vedic side, Vedanta side, would completely agree with the Buddha in all of this. They would say, exactly, right on. These temporary things are not the eternal self. So our book, Indian Philosophy, tries to put in contrast the Buddha not denying the self, but denying any temporary things as self, which is very different than the people who affirm a self. I totally didn't get that because the people on the Vedic side that said there is an eternal soul would exactly agree with this. They're not saying temporary things are the self. So that was a, yes?
So is Buddha trying to say that there's one soul, which is everything?
It's a good question. What you just asked probably was the main question, the whole Vedanta debate that went on for centuries. We'll talk about that. Because some people said there's a supreme soul, God, and there's many individual souls, us. Other people said there's only one conglomerate thing. So we'll talk a lot about that a little later. The Buddha teaches that one should focus not on ontological issues, but on the operation of one's cognitive faculties, psychology, etc., etc., etc. We only have access to our subjective experiences. We cannot get outside this to see or check what might be the case, etc., etc. So, now in Buddhism, this is very basic stuff. In Buddhism, they had three sources of authority. And they were called pitakas, baskets, which is kind of quaint. So the three pitaka, the three baskets, are the Sutra Pitaka, Sutta in Pali, which is Buddhist teachings, what people believed were the original teachings of the historical Buddha. Then you have the Vinaya, which is the discipline. If you want to be a Buddhist monk, these are the rules. You know, like, can you eat salt? Can you not eat salt? Like, what about your buttermilk? All that stuff. What time do you have to get up? So all those monastic disciplinary rules are the Vinaya. And then the Abhidharma, because for the simple reason that people couldn't exactly figure out like what the Buddha said, like what does that mean in practice. So they had a third basket which was trying to interpret what this all means. That's the Abhidharma. So those are the three basic sources of authority. And here's a quote from our book, page 88, Indian Philosophy. Because of the cryptic or ambiguous nature of the way the teachings were first presented, the Abhidharma was necessary. The cryptic or ambiguous nature of the original teachings. The Abhidharmikas, that means people that did Abhidharma, studied it and taught it, inherited from the earliest states of Buddhism teachings that were far from philosophically explicit and which were primarily concerned with soteriological efficacy, which means, will it get you salvation? You know, will this get you to nirvana or not? Like, if it, the truth of what works. That kind of idea. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. So if this doesn't set you free, it's the wrong thing. And if it sets you free, it must be the truth. So very practical like that. Now, the oldest surviving documents from Buddhism are the Pali Canon. Pali is a language, which is a sort of vernacular language from Sanskrit. As I said before, it's kind of like Sanskrit with a Brooklyn accent. So you have Pali, and then there are a certain set of books, which are their three baskets, the Pali baskets. And so that's these are the oldest surviving documents. So you could say, well, maybe that is, to use a term from Christianity, primitive Buddhism, in the sense of like original Buddhism. But there's a problem. You can't just accept the Pali Canon as the original Buddhism. Why? Well, so much of the material, no doubt, dates from a few centuries after the Buddha. So within that Pali Canon, we've got a lot of stuff that everyone agrees is centuries after the historical Buddha. when people were already interpreting and giving their own ideas about everything. And so it's not possible to accept the Pali materials as incontrovertible account of the Buddha's teachings. Here's another problem. The Theravada represents, that's what it's called. Actually, the word Theravada, sort of the opposite of Mahayana, and Thera is the Pali word for Stavita in Sanskrit, which means an elder. So it's kind of, so Theravada, Vada means speech or ism or teaching, so it's like the teachings of the elders. Theravada Buddhism, which is the other main branch of Buddhism after Mahayana, or before Mahayana. So another problem is that much Theravada material, Sutta Pitaka, because you're trying to get back to the original Buddha, you're going to be in this basket, right? Because the disciplines came later, and the Abhidharma's interpretation, so you're trying to work your way back to the historical Buddha, the original Buddha. What did he really say? Then you have to be in this basket. So in the Pali Sutra Pitaka, which is the earliest stuff we have, which might be what Buddha really taught, but in that Theravada Sutra Pitaka material, so first of all, it represents only one, the Theravada, of the original 18 sects of Buddhism, and was supplanted in India by more successful groups such as Sarvastika. So in other words, first of all, the Pali Canon, a lot of it is centuries later than Buddha, and secondly, it wasn't even that important in India. Because there were other groups that didn't survive, their documents didn't survive, but they were much more important in India. And so the Pali Canon does not give us a picture of what everybody was doing. Yes?
So, in regards to the 18 groups that developed,
Mm-hmm.
I was sort of taught that that was more of a convenient number, like an auspicious number, and like could sort of fictitious in a way.
Even, let's say if they rounded off to 18, what that tells us is it probably wasn't 2 or 3, maybe it wasn't 100, but it may be a ballpark figure.
Okay.
But I don't think, in other words, I think it would be silly to say that there weren't any groups. Everybody was doing the same thing, and they just thought, hey, let's call ourselves 18.
But I've only, in research, I've only seen like 7 or 8.
Okay?
And, you know.
Even if, well, for one thing, a lot of them didn't survive.
Okay.
In fact, we know about some of them because we have Chinese translations of their writings. So a lot of the stuff didn't survive, and another sort of like one of the deep, dark secrets of foodology, which is what they call this, is that a lot of the stuff hasn't been translated yet. So, yeah, so it's all a little bit up in the air, and it may not be exactly 18, but it's a bunch. And that's kind of the relevant point. Yes?
Isn't it kind of impossible to know what the Buddha said because he specifically, or so to say, specifically tells people not to take, what he says is absolute truth, but you got to find it on your own way. So he obviously didn't want stuff written down, like he didn't want to write down a bunch of rules while he was alive, and kind of like the Moses with the tablets and be like, well, exactly what you have to do. So I mean, like, why do you think people 100 years later thought that they needed to write down these like scriptures or these sutras?
Well, because history changed and the time came when just you needed to compete. In other words, if Buddhism wanted to be a contender in India, everyone else was talking about heaven and talking about yoga and all kinds of things. And if they said, never mind all that, you're suffering. In other words, what was revolutionary and interesting hundreds of years ago was kind of outdated. Because as far as this stuff here, everybody was saying that after a while. Everybody was saying that, and pretty much everybody was saying this. And so if that's all you said, no one would take you that seriously. So Buddhism survived. So we'll get into that now. Like, what did they actually do? Like, what did they come up with to stay in the ball game, so to speak? It's like if you're running a certain play, and at first you always score, and then after a while the defense figures you out, and you like get nowhere. You have to come up with another play. Otherwise, it wouldn't have survived. Yes.
So one of the reasons that Buddhism succeeded mostly is because it, what do you call it, dismissed the caste system. That was really what's drawing people in.
in the beginning, that was interesting. That was certainly attractive. But then again, Buddhism kind of built its own caste system to some extent. For example, kings were very important, and no one wanted to offend the king because they were paying all the bills and they had a lot of weapons and things. And so you definitely had a king caste, and then you had Buddhist saints, and they became sort of like Brahmins. There was a little more mobility because you could become a Buddhist saint. It wasn't as strictly hereditary, but that was an attractive feature. But then again, you see, as we'll learn later, on the Hindu side or Vedic side, you get these very powerful bhakti movements, devotion to Krishna or to Rama, to Shiva, and so on, or to the goddess. And in those devotional movements, they also reject the caste system. So it's like, it's like one-stop shopping. You have a lot more freedom from the caste system, plus you have all this positive devotion. And so, as we'll see, there's this very powerful comeback from the Vedic Hindu side, which actually sweeps over India and even other parts of Asia. It actually sweeps over Indonesia, Cambodia. So there's a very powerful and ultimately successful comeback on the Vedic Hindu side, and they get the message. And so in these bhakti traditions, they also strongly criticize the oppression of the caste system. They emphasize it again and again that in God's eyes, what matters is love and devotion. It doesn't matter your birth, what your birth is. So again, that sort of like that really cool thing that Buddhism and Jainism had earlier. It's like, we don't accept this oppressive caste system. Suddenly you get this powerful movement from within the Vedic tradition, which also strongly teaches it. In some ways, even more powerfully teaches it because they have even a better justification for it, which is that in God's eyes we're all equal, which was the point of Jesus. And then the point, so all these, and then for example, the Buddhist, Jain de-emphasis of technical ritual. You find exactly that point in the Bhakti traditions. They say what matters is love. What matters is actually to love God, to love other souls. It's not about technical rituals. So I think you can see that from the Buddhism, some of their key selling points, it's like, if you've got your little route and you go around and you sell some product, and suddenly there's competition, and the competition has all the features you have, plus they're throwing in the floor mats or something. So there really is a marketplace of religion, not in the sense that everyone is just motivated by money, but supply and demand. People have certain religious needs, certain desires, and whoever can satisfy those desires flourishes. So because there was freedom in India, now in a sense the competition, let's say in Europe in the Middle Ages, was sort of suppressed because if you taught the wrong thing, you could just be tortured and killed. And so that tended to discourage people. Most people, given their choice, choose not to be tortured and killed. So in India, what's different in India is you have this tremendous freedom. It's a liberal, educated civilization with this tremendous freedom, and so everyone's competing. And if you're not competitive, then you're gone. In a closed society, even if you're, let's say like the old Soviet regime, you may, let's say you manufacture, I don't know, children's toys, and you really manufacture terrible children's toys. It's like, it's just junk. But it's a Soviet regime, and no one else in the country is allowed to manufacture children's toys. So guess what? You sell everything you make. Because you have this enforced, non-competition. So in countries where there is no religious freedom, a religion can become extremely decadent, and that's your tough luck. But where there's open competition, the extent that competition forces people to produce and to come up with a good product, then anyway, you can see what happened. So India was a free society, actually, going back to the earliest days. So, perfection of wisdom, which I'm sure you all aspire for. The Prajna Parimita, which was a book. It was a book through the early days leading to Mahayana, which started around the time of Jesus, actually, roughly around that time, which began to come with new ideas. Here's an interesting quote. The perfection of wisdom is bewildering, full of paradox and apparent irrationality. Yet, experiencing So one scholar says that the thousands of lines of this book, the Pragya Parimita, can be summed up in 2 sentences. One should become a bodhisattva, a Buddha to be. In other words, like a Buddhist saint who comes back life after life to save other people. One should become a bodhisattva, one who is content with nothing less than all knowledge attained through the perfection of wisdom for the sake of all beings. 2, there is no such thing as a bodhisattva, or as all knowledge, or as a being, or as the perfection of wisdom, or as an attainment. To accept both of these contradictory facts is to be perfect. So, I will reveal my bias. I personally am not a big fan of word games. I kind of like straight talk, like say what you mean. And so the way I interpret this is that, yes, there are bodhisattvas. Yes, there is a perfection of wisdom. Yes, you can make advancement, because that's what everybody was trying to do. However, when you actually become perfect, you don't think in these terms. You don't think that I'm perfect. You don't think, you're humble. So rather than say, you should become a bodhisattva, but when you do, be humble and don't be proud of your attainments, they prefer to have these sort of paradoxical statements that, anyway, some people like paradoxical statements, but that's basically what the idea is. So, now, a lot of people started to think this is very negative, because competing with Buddhism, you had other people on the Vedic Hindu side saying, there's a spiritual world, there's a God, there's a soul, like, your mother died, where did she go? I mean, let's say someone you really love passed away, and someone tells you, your mother's in heaven, and you can be reunited with your mother in heaven, and she's happy now. And someone else says, well, she never existed anyway. I mean, where are you going to put your dime? And again, most people in India or anywhere else in the world are not philosophers, are not like sophisticated intellectuals, just regular people. And when someone you really love passes away, you don't want to hear they never existed or there is no self. And so basically there was this undertow, this tremendous pressure to give answers that actually satisfied people, that made sense to people. Because most people experience themselves as a person. That's how we actually experience ourselves, as people. And so sophisticated ideas like there's no self, it's interesting intellectually, but when you actually go out into the world, you really feel and act and walk and talk like a person. And what we find in Buddhist history, no matter how much they meditated, the overwhelming majority of Buddhist meditators ended up being like people. And they were very concerned about their future lives. They were very concerned about the destiny of their forefathers, ancestors, foremothers. I mean, they were very concerned about personal life and what's going to happen to me and what happened to my ancestors and my children and so on. So this thing of no self, it was an interesting intellectual idea. It just had very little to do with people's real lives. And therefore, 85% of the of Buddhists today in the world are Mahayana, which very much believe that there is a heaven, a paradise, you can go there, and your ancestors can go there, and that's what really won in Buddhism. The no-self stuff, intellectually interesting, maybe, but on the ground, in the real world, for people's practical, emotional lives, it didn't have much traction because it just struck almost everybody as not the way life really is. I really exist, and I've got to deal with that. And my family really exists, and my friends, and we have to deal with it. That was the real world, and that's what's won out. So, Nagarjuna. I want to speak about Nagarjuna, who's a very famous Buddhist philosopher, perhaps the most famous Buddhist philosopher. Nagarjuna looked around at all this stuff that was going on, the Sarvastivada, which they believed that the world, kind of things in the world really exist, even if they're temporary. And the Pudgalavada we talked about last time, believed there's some kind of person. That the idea that there's no person, no self, really is not where it's at. And so Nagarjuna was a monk. He looked around and he said, boy, the Buddhist world is really off track. I mean, we've really forgotten our original teachings. So he came up with a view called shunyata, emptiness, or shunyavad, emptiness. And this was based on an analysis of the world called pratitya samutpada. You probably haven't heard of this, most of you. It shows you how famous it eventually became. Anyway, this is very important in the Buddhist world. Pratitya in Sanskrit means evident, recognizable, apparent, and samutpada means origination. The idea, in a nutshell, what Nagarjuna said is that everything that exists dependently. Like take, for example, this room. If you look at this room, let's say the bricks in the wall there, and the bricks are made of different molecules. The molecules are made of atoms, and the atoms are made of different subatomic particles, and who knows what they are. And so it depends on the law of gravity, and so if you look at anything, you can sort of divide it, dissolve it into various components. Those components depend on other components. Nothing really exists independently. Even ourselves. We speak English because we grew up among English speakers, and we are alive because trucks come into the city and bring food, and et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, there's a police force which kind of keeps the crime level down to survivable levels. In other words, we're all dependent. But the basis of our Nagarjuna's teaching, and this is really central Buddhist philosophy, which I don't get, I have to admit, I don't get it, is that when you say that something exists, what you mean is that it exists independently. Now, personally, that's not at all what I mean. I'm very much aware that I have a mother and father, and that I biologically, I'm in the biological condition I am now because I have a mother and father. I'm very much aware that I depend on other people. You know, I have friends, I have family, we have certain people we depend upon emotionally to, or physically or militarily or whatever. So I don't at all think that I exist absolutely independently, but I'm quite sure I exist. And so this assumption, which is really at the heart of this doctrine of emptiness, which I totally don't get, is that to say something exists means what you mean is that it exists independently. That's not what I personally mean. And so, anyway, that's what he taught, that nothing exists because everything, and there's no eternal soul that exists independently. There's certainly no God that exists independently. So what was the reaction of Nagarjuna? Because Nagarjuna was kind of like back to basics, back to our roots. This is what Buddha really wanted to teach. You guys have just gone crazy, because of all these bad Hindu influences. You're trying to compete and everything. You're speculating too much. You're sitting around in your monasteries. You've got too much time on your hands. You're thinking too much. And let's just get back to basic Buddhism. So, what was the reaction to all this? He had a disciple named Chandrakirti who wrote. So, Chandrakirti felt that Nagarjuna's view was that Nagarjuna did not have a thesis. Nagarjuna was not trying to say what the truth was, but his middle path, Nagarjuna claimed he was getting back to the middle path, involves the repudiation of all fixed views. In other words, Nagarjuna wanted to show that everybody else's philosophy leads to an absurdity. Everybody else's philosophy, if you think about it and analyze it, leads to absurdity. Therefore, you cannot put forward any philosophy. Let's go back to Buddha, where no philosophy is valid. Now, the idea that what I just said is not a philosophy, I think, is absurd. In other words, I think obviously to say that no philosophy is valid is self-contradictory, because that is a philosophy. And if it's not valid, then it's not valid that no philosophy is valid, etc., etc. It's like never say never. I mean, that is a philosophy. And how does Nagarjuna know that nothing's permanent? I mean, if you make a negative claim, it's just as ambitious as a positive claim. If I say there's nothing in the universe that's permanent, in other words, no soul, there's nothing like a permanent self, which is, well, how does he know that? How does he actually know that? I mean, Nagarjuna wouldn't say he's God because he doesn't accept the notion of God. And if he's not God, is he omniscient? Does Nagarjuna claim omniscience? And if he's not omniscient, then how can you say there's no eternal soul? And if he is omniscient, is that omniscience permanent? And if so, does that contradict his idea that nothing's permanent? Can you be omniscient temporarily? In other words, I think when you try to show that everybody's philosophy is absurd, you end up being absurd yourself. That's the point I'm making. That's how I see it philosophically. And so he had some influence, but most people wanted to go on thinking about the world and not just accept that every philosophy is absurd. In fact, even Nagarjuna's followers couldn't agree. Even his followers couldn't figure out what he meant. On whether he wanted to show everyone that everyone else was absurd or posit his own ideas. And in general, there was a sense that Nagarjuna had gone too far. That this could lead to nihilism. In other words, people in India started to worry that the way Nagarjuna's talking, and even the way the Patigya Paramita's talking, that there, be a bodhisattva, but realize there is no bodhisattva, it could lead to nihilism, like nothing is real, sort of like strawberry fields forever, like nothing is real, and there's no meaning to anything, and people back then, even in ancient times in India, became seriously concerned that this kind of talk was going to really take people over the edge. That this kind of, everything is empty, nothing exists, this was really going too far. And so because of that, there were reactions, and other Buddhist schools started to become prominent, such as Yogacara. Now at the time, yoga was very popular in India, so the Yogacara school basically said that it's almost like, how should I put it? It's like when all these Eastern movements came over to America in the 60s and 70s, like yoga and meditation and Krishna and this and that. And then it's very interesting that you have these mainstream churches and Jewish movements that realize that we have to compete. So for example, where I lived in LA, I'm from LA, there's a large Jewish population there, and so we would get things at our doorstep saying that, for example, come and do meditation and yoga and all this stuff. They would use all the New Age language, but it was within Judaism, which I think is valid because, they have those kinds of spiritual resources in their tradition. So in the same way, the Buddhist said, like, hey, if you're a Buddhist, you can do yoga here. You don't have to change your religion to do yoga. But that's basically what it amounts to. They came up with a yoga system, and they were serious about it, and they had some very bright, sincere people doing it. And so that was called the Yogacara movement, which was kind of like Nagarjuna, kind of people felt there's nowhere to go here. Like nothing exists, there's nowhere to go. So the Yogacara school became somewhat popular in Buddhism. Now, having said all that, I want to use the last time remaining to me, for those of you who are somehow still awake after all this philosophy. Don't move too suddenly, you may wake up your neighbor. So, what I want to show now is that there actually were a lot of people in the Buddhist world who just didn't go for all this emptiness stuff, and they were moving back to the Vedic tradition. In fact, it's a cliche among historians that by 1,000 years after the historical Buddha, Buddhism in India had practically, if not merged back into the Vedic tradition, it had become in many ways indistinguishable from it, or another branch of it. So to give you an example of how within Buddhism, and this is mainstream Buddhism, you start to get powerful concepts which are bringing Buddhism back to its original matrix, which is the Vedic culture. I already talked about the Pudgalavadas. But maybe someday we'll have a Pudgalavada club there in the U.S. Anyway, so you started to get these ideas in Buddhism a few thousand years ago. For example, a Buddha nature, Buddha Dhatu. So which is the idea that inside all of us there is a luminous mind. In other words, within all of us there is an original pure consciousness. This is very Vedantesque. Within all of us there's an original pure consciousness, so that when you become enlightened, you're reviving that original pure consciousness, which is who you really are. And they have the term, actually I should write some of this stuff. Where? I don't know if you've seen this term, Tathagata. It's a very important word in Buddhism. Tatha means thus, agata, come, arrived, thus arrived. So there's Tathagata Garbha, the idea that in Mahayana, now this is Mahayana, that everyone is kind of an embryonic Buddha. Not only was Buddha this great enlightened figure who went to this super paradise and who had all knowledge, but every one of us is actually a Buddha in the making. Every one of us has that pure enlightened consciousness within us. It simply has to be revived. So Garbha means embryo. So that idea, and that your original Buddha nature is a real, eternally existing essence. You have all the qualities of a Buddha. You are an enlightened being. You just have to wake up and realize it. You have to realize who you really are. Now, for example, and the term was used synonymously with Atman. I mean, this is one of the two most important words in Vedic Hindu philosophy, Atman, the self or the soul. And so the Buddhists started to use their terms like Tathagata Garbha, synonymously with the word Atma. Like when the Vedantas say Atma, we have that. So you see it's coming very close. So basically there's an eternal conscious being inside, and that's the real you. And this is practically non-distinguishable from a lot of Vedic Vedanta philosophy. There was a Tibetan Buddhist school founded by Yumo Mikyo Dorje in the 11th century. So please memorize that fact. And this school was often viewed with suspicion by other schools for their controversial interpretation of embryonic Tathagata Buddhism. In other words, they were saying there's a real self, it's an Atman. They just like the Hindus say, and the school still survives in Tibet today, although it was severely suppressed. It was persecuted during the reign of Dalai Lama V, who's not the present Dalai Lama, of course. But the history of Dalai Lamas, they weren't always as sublime as they are today. They actually, there's a period, a whole history of very political and militaristic Dalai Lamas who suppressed inappropriate views. That's another topic. So here's the kind of like the quote of the day, I think, which really shows what real Buddhism was like. This is from our book on Buddhism, page 43. Belief in a continued personal existence. Belief in a continued personal existence in some form or other after death would seem to be a minimal requirement for most traditions of Buddhist thought. A minimal requirement is belief in continuing personal existence. So much for the non-self, so much for everything's empty, nothing's permanent. Belief in permanent personal existence is a minimal requirement for most forms of Buddhism. Buddha, here's a quote from our book, Buddha believed that a person's moral identity, what we might call the individual's spiritual DNA, survives death and is reborn. So how can a moral identity be impersonal? I mean, moral identity means your sense of right and wrong, your sense of how to treat other people. I mean, how can a moral identity be impersonal? And then a statement, again, in our book on Buddhism, trying to sort of waffling and trying to negotiate this fact that they really do appear to talk about a soul, but they're not supposed to talk about a soul. The continuity of individual existence. The continuity of individual existence from one life to the next is simply the result of the accumulated momentum of desire. So my question is, how can we assign moral responsibility to, quote, the accumulated momentum of desire? Again, in real Buddhism, you have this, so the Buddhist world is very diverse. There's all kinds of tensions and different views. There are people that really want to say there's no self, but most Buddhists were very concerned about their future identity, their salvation, the salvation of their family, their ancestors. Ultimately, a minimal requirement for most Buddhist schools was to believe in that somehow you survive after death as a person, which is basically identical to mainstream Hindu and Vedic views, Vedanta views. And so we can see that it starts with this very Spartan, no frills, simple psychology, and then over time comes back to its own matrix, comes back to the Vedic matrix. Although, yes?
This is kind of a general question.
Yeah, go ahead.
And do you know when this idea that there is an afterlife started? What religion did it start with?
Oh, you mean in general, world religions?
Like how it started, and it became sort of a dominant factor in almost every religion because everybody caught on. And
Right. I think it goes all the way back. I mean, I think it would be hard to find, like say in the Vedas. In the Vedas, yeah, in terms of an explicit doctrine of reincarnation with all kinds of details, you find reference to this, but not detailed explanations, because it's like, let's say you're an expert cook, and someone says to you, like, can you cook dinner tonight? That's all you have to say. But let's say you've never cooked in your life. We got to sit down and talk about it for a couple hours. So in a sense, the more you know, the less information you need. So the fact that in earlier Vedic literature there are just very simple references to future lives or past lives would indicate not necessarily, as scholars sometimes assume, that it was not a developed idea, but that simply everyone knew about it. There was nothing to talk about.
Okay, there's totally there.
But you do find in the oldest Upanishads, we'll talk about the Upanishads, which is kind of like the knowledge portion of the Vedas, and yeah, they talk very explicitly about past and future lives.
Just curious.
Sure. Yes.
I understood that Yogacara was a reaction to the Gargoon, but I didn't understand exactly what the... I didn't understand what that philosophy was. For you.
Basically, it was just the inner exploration of consciousness, very much, meditation. Like, let's meditate and try to understand consciousness, try to discover ourselves within, and just, trying to go deeply within and understand the nature of consciousness, as opposed to just trying to refute everyone else's philosophy. Let's just try to understand our own consciousness.
Could Yogacara be classified as Mahayana Buddhism?
Yeah, I'd say roughly, you could say, within that umbrella. Yes?
I think I missed what you said about the Kaushalya.
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 Yeah, Kaushalya. Upaya. Kaushalya means like expertise, and Upaya, the means to accomplish something. So basically, any Buddhist philosopher or teacher who wanted to teach something that couldn't be traced back to the historical Buddha, this is what Mahayana did. They say, well, Buddha only taught those things historically because that's what people could understand. You find this exact same argument given at exactly the same time in the New Testament. That Jesus taught certain things because that's what people could understand at the time. This is what he really meant. And the same argument is given in Buddhism. So it's sort of a blank check. I mean, it's like, sky's the limit now.
So you said it means expertise and...
Means. Yeah, the means. So Buddha, the example is given that if there's a bunch of children in a house that's on fire and you can't coax them out, you tell them, hey kids, there's a bunch of candy out here, so they'll run out of the house to get the candy. So Mahayana was actually extremely negative about early Buddhism. They saw the early Buddhists as kind of not very bright and more or less infantile. And Shaliputra, I think his name is, who was like, he started the Abhidharma. He was a disciple of the Buddha, direct disciple. And when people had questions about technicalities, Buddha would kind of say, well, talk to Shaliputra because he's kind of philosophical. So in the original Buddhist community, Shaliputra was like the brain. He was the big thinker. But in Mahayana Buddhism, he's kind of like a clown. He's sort of portrayed as a buffoon because they so much looked down upon that early simple Buddhism. So the Buddhist world is extremely diverse. Starting Friday, if any of you actually make the supreme sacrifice and come to class on Friday, we are going to start talking about the Vedic reaction. And we're going to start with some of the more, not the most dramatic and successful ones, but we're going to start to see how the Vedic culture reacted to this challenge of Buddhism, Jainism, and how they started to assert themselves, and ultimately they were successful. So I guess we'll stop here.